Hello and welcome to our video presentation about human rights. The contents we'll be dealing with are the following.
The civil rights movement was a nonviolent social movement and campaign from 1954 to 1968 in the United States to abolish legalized racial segregation, discrimination, and discrimination in the country. The movement had the origins in the Reconstruction era during the late 19th century and had its modern roots in 1940s. Although the movement made its largest livespeed gains in 1960 after years of direct actions and grassroots protest. The social movement's major nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience. Campaign eventually issued new protection in federal law for the civil rights of all Americans.
The Montgomery bus boycott, which occurred from December 1955 to December 1956, was a pivotal political and social protest against racial segregation on public buses in Montgomery, Alabama. Triggered by Rosa Parks' arrest for refusing to give up her seat to a white person, it ultimately led to a U.S. Supreme Court decision declaring segregation laws unconstitutional. African Americans face discrimination, violence, and mistreatment while using the bus system, despite being the majority of its riders. The boycott, often seen as the beginning of the civil rights movement, was part of a broader effort for civil rights, including other court cases and protests across the country.
The March on Washington. The March on Washington, held on August 28 of 1963, was an historic political demonstration in Washington, D.C., attended by an estimated of 250,000 people. Its primary goals were to protest racial discrimination and express support for significant civil rights legislations pending in Congress. It was organized by the Big Six civil rights leaders, including James Farmer, Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, Phil Rudolph, Roy Willings, and Wuthering Young. Along with activist Rayard Rustin, the march aimed to gather people peacefully on the National Mall near of Lincoln Memorial to advocate for equal justice for all citizens. The event featured musical performances by Marian Anderson, Mahalia Jackson, Joan Baez, and Bob Dylan. Several speakers, both part of the official program and others not, addressed the crowd. These included John Lewis, Roy Wilkins, Wuthering Young, Daisy Bates, Walter Reuther, and Josephine Baker, among others. The event also paid tribute to prominent black women involved in the civil rights movement, such as Rosa Parks and Marilyn Evers. The culmination of the event was Martin Luther King Jr.'s iconic speech, "I Have a Dream," which passionately called for equality and freedom. This speech became a defining moment in the civil rights movement and a cornerstone of American history.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a landmark civil rights and labor law in the United States that outlaws discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. It prohibits unequal application of voter registration requirements, racial segregations in schools and public accommodations, and employment discrimination. The Act remains one of the most significant legislative achievements in American history.
Voting Rights Act of 1965. This act was signed into law on August 6 of 1965 by the President Lyndon Johnson. It outlawed the discriminatory voting practices adopted in many southern states after the Civil War, including literacy tests as prerequisites to voting. This act, to enforce the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, was signed into law 95 years after the amendment was ratified. In those years, African Americans in the South faced tremendous obstacles to voting, including poll taxes, literacy tests, and other bureaucratic restrictions to deny them the right to vote. They also risked harassment, intimidation, economic reprisals, and physical violence when they tried to register or vote. As a result, African American voter registration was limited, along with political power. Martin Luther King Jr., who was born in Atlanta, Georgia, on January 15 of 1929 and died in Memphis, Tennessee, on April 4 of 1968, was an American Baptist minister and activist who became the spokesman and most visible leader of the civil rights movement from 1955 until his assassination in 1968. African-American church leader and son of the early activist and civil rights minister Martin Luther King Sr., who led the civil rights movement to African Americans and who, in addition, participated as an activist in numerous protests against the Vietnam War and poverty in general. For this activity, aimed at ending American segregation and racial discrimination through non-violent means, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. 4 years later, at a time when he was working especially orientated towards opposition to the war and the fight against poverty, was assassinated. Rosa Louise Macaulay Parks was born on Tuskegee, Alabama, the 4th of February of 1930, and died in Detroit, Michigan, the 24th of October of 2005, was an African-American activist, an important figure in the civil rights movement in the United States for occupying a seat for white instead of one in the back of the bus for people of color during a protest organized with equal actions in Montgomery, Alabama, on December 1st of 1955. For this action, she ended up being arrested, which is frequently cited as the spark of the movement and it recognized as the first lady of civil rights. Haj Malik El-Shabazz, and known as Malcolm X, was born on Omaha, Nebraska, the 29th of May of 1925, and died on New York, the 21st of February of 1965, was an American speaker, religious minister, and activist. He was a defender of human rights and civil liberties for African Americans, a man who harshly accused white Americans of their crimes against their black companions. Instead, his detractors accused him of preaching racism and violence. He has been described as one of the most influential people in American history and as one of the most important leaders of the civil liberties movement.
In conclusion, the brown people of 1960s had much less rights and privileges than white people. Because of this, many brown people began to march and protest for their equal rights. Among all people, and they take this from a lot of years until all persons have the same rights. But unfortunately, there are people who still think that brown people have less rights than white persons. And in conclusion, I think that Rosa Parks, she did well not let her seat to a white person, because she makes more black people start to make respect and more protest about the equal rights, and because all people should have the same rights. And Martin Luther King, he motivated a lot of black people to make them respect, at same as Malcolm X. Both the movie and the civil rights movement have a common theme of addressing racial segregation and discrimination, particularly against African Americans. During the early 1960s in the United States, they both acknowledged the historical context of this period, where racial inequality was perceived. Additional, both indirectly highlight the importance of achieving equal rights and opportunity for all the citizens, regardless of the race, as a central goal associating with the civil rights movement. While the movie does, with the length of the storyline in a movie, the movement provides a more general and factual overview of the movement itself. In sense, they share a common thread of recognizing the significance of civil rights movements in challenging racial injustice and striving for equality.